Hey everybody, and welcome. My name is Rob Phelan, also known as the FI Educator Online, and I'm here today with a special guest. His name's Aaron Thomas. He is a lawyer who's going to talk to us about prenuptial agreements. Now, prenups. Do you know what a prenup is? And if you do, is it one of those topics that we just don't talk about because it's so taboo? And it's one of these things that bringing it up itself is a can of worms that most people don't even want to breach. That is what we're going to try and talk about today to make it feel a little bit more normal and help you realize that, you know what? Everyone's got a prenup, whether they know it or not, the moment they get married. And that was one of my favorite lines that Aaron threw out. I was like, oh yeah, like that is actually true. And this is something that we do need to talk about because marriage and divorce, which goes hand in hand with marriage sometimes, is a huge impact on our finances. Marriage on one end, divorce on the other, if it happens. And we want to make sure that we are addressing those and not ignoring it just because it's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about. So Aaron, tell us a little about yourself and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Rob. Excited to be here. I am a family law attorney. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been practicing family law for over 20 years, and about half that time, I've really had a specialty in prenuptial and postnuptial agreements.
What made you fascinated in that?
Really going through hundreds of divorce cases where I saw that a lot of people, the problem that they had when it came to dividing their finances in a divorce is they never really had the important conversations as how they were going to join their finances when they got married. And it just struck me that we could avoid a lot of predictable fights that people have over money if we could help couples join their finances in the correct way when they're at the beginning of their relationship.
Okay, so like this is not just planning for the end. This is like planning for how marriage should go too, I'm guessing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think, a lot of people think that a prenup is literally just you're writing out your divorce agreement before the marriage even begins.
Yes.
I think it is better to look at a prenup like a partnership agreement for your marriage. So we're going to talk about how you set up your accounts and what your responsibilities will be financially during the marriage itself. And then, yes, just like if you had a business partnership agreement, we're going to talk about what happens if the partnership comes to an end. But the primary goal should be to avoid fights during the marriage itself. And then, yes, obviously, if the marriage comes to an end, avoid that turning into a big fight as well.
And I know it probably, you might get told like it sounds cold to talk about a marriage this way, like a business agreement. But those of you in high school, I mean, you've done the group projects. You know what happens when we don't set expectations ahead of time or outline roles. There ends up being resentment. There ends up being a imbalance in terms of who's doing what and how it's getting done. And it ends up with arguments or the group falling apart or a bad grade at the end. And if we think about marriage in a similar light, like it's definitely different. Like there's more to it than just this black and white agreement. But why not start with a foundation like that? It's definitely something that we want to talk about a little bit more. Okay, so tell us a bit more about the kind of nuts and bolts. Like, how does a prenup work? What happens? A couple wants to get married, so this is before marriage, right?
Yes, yeah. Prenup is an agreement that a couple comes to before marriage that defines their financial relationship, both during the marriage and if it comes to an end. And so typically the types of things that people are going to do is number one, both spouses have to disclose all of their assets and debts to each other. So usually they write it down in what we'll call a net worth statement, where they'll list out all of their bank accounts. If they've got a house, if they've got a car, if they've got a retirement account, we'll put those down on paper as well as how much they're worth. And then you do the same thing for their debts. Are there student loans? Are there credit card debts? Do you have a car loan? Do you have a mortgage? And we'll add all of that up, and the couple will share that information with each other. And then from there, we'll basically decide what belongs in each column, what belongs to spouse number one, what belongs to spouse number two, and what belongs to the couple jointly. And just having that kind of explicit, defined expectation at the beginning can avoid a lot of arguments about who's responsible for what or who owns what in the marriage.
But isn't it going to create a problem where you're kind of like going into a marriage and be like, well, this is mine, that's yours, and like, aren't we supposed to be joining everything? What's yours is mine when we go into marriage?
I think that that is how the laws were written
Mhm.
hundreds of years ago when couples got married at age 20, age 21 on average. People today get married on average closer to age 30 Often people get married much later than that in life. And by that point, most people have 4 or 5 bank accounts. They've got 3 or 4 credit cards. They may have student loans, could be in the 6 figures potentially. They may have a lot of retirement saved up. They may already own a home. And for a lot of these couples, it doesn't make sense to, maybe I don't want you to be responsible for my student loans that I took out before we even met. Or maybe you decide that it wouldn't be fair for me to automatically get half of the equity you've built up in your house when I'm just moving in right now, and maybe you've been living there for 5 or 10 years. And so what a prenup does is it basically allows people to kind of customize what goes into the shared assets, into the shared bank accounts, rather than just pushing everything together that you've accumulated over your entire life, which a lot of people don't think is fair.
Yeah, and I think that point I had never considered before yet. The age of marriage has gotten much further along. So normally, yeah, you both have nothing, or you have whatever you inherited from your families. And that's you starting your lives together, and you start from the ground and you build it up together. So it makes sense to split it down the middle. But getting married later or remarriage, like you're coming into it with much more debts and equity that's, yeah, maybe you want to keep separate if things don't work out. Do you have any stats, by the way, on what percentage of marriages are not working out at the moment, just so we can kind of lay that out for students?
Yeah, it is. It varies, but right now it's around 43%. So almost half of marriages end in divorce. The average divorce that happens in a marriage happens around 8 years into the marriage. And the average cost of divorce is about $15,000 per spouse. So $30,000 for the couple. Obviously, often it can cost way more than that. And so the idea is a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement costs a tiny fraction of that. And if you can get on the same page about what would happen in the event of a divorce, you can save some of the time and the stress and the cost of a divorce case on the back end if that happens. And hopefully it at least gives you some clarity and gets you and your spouse on the same page. So maybe you don't have those arguments that sometimes lead to divorce.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we never go into marriage thinking that, hey, this is going to end someday. And that's the hard part. And that's what makes this conversation very difficult, is that nobody goes into marriage being like, yeah, I'll give this a good 8 years and then I'm going to be out of here. Everyone goes in with the idea of like, this is forever. This is my person. Like, this is my best friend. This is the person that I trust beyond, whatever. And we don't anticipate this black swan event, this thing happening that nobody's foreseeing happening, even though 43% of marriages end in divorce. So it's one of those things, guys, that we have to also just be aware of these things before we move forward. We can't move forward blindly. We have to just be aware, like, okay, this can happen. Is the 30,000 per couple, is that just like in lawyer fees, or is that like your loss of net worth after you split everything up?
That's just in lawyers' fees.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of other costs. Going through a divorce case is obviously very stressful. If you have kids involved, then you're talking about splitting up time with the children, and it is much more expensive for 2 people to support 2 households than it is to support 1 household. So typically in a divorce, both spouses suffer a reduction in their standard of living. And so that's something else to think about.
Yeah. And, we know the stats. We know that many of you watching have been on the receiving end of that as the kid who's been a part of a divorce. And you might be a little bit more aware than those of us who maybe have not been part of a divorce. And that's something that, sharing that experience or learning from it is something that you can take forward with you as you go forward into your own relationships. I want to go back to that quote I threw out at the beginning. So, you have a prenup, whether you know it or not. Tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that, because I thought like, no, I didn't create a prenup with my wife. I don't have a prenup, but I'm not right, am I?
No. So, a prenup at its most basic is it's a set of rules. It's a contract that defines your financial relationship with your spouse. And the truth of the matter is, you either make those rules for your financial relationship with your spouse yourself in the form of a written prenup that you draft and you put on paper and you sign, or the state that you live in is writing those rules for you. Your state's laws are what I call your default prenup. And those laws vary from state to state. And so often what we see is a lot of people don't know what the rules are for their assets and debts. And they don't realize that they have entered into this contract essentially until they are going through a divorce. And often people are very surprised as what happens to their assets. A very common example is a retirement account, like a 401k. You work at your job, you're putting money away in your retirement account, and then you get married and you keep contributing to that retirement account. And a lot of people think, well, I've kept it in my own name. I'm the only one who contributed to it. So if anything ever happened in my marriage, if I got divorced, I would keep that retirement account. And then they're surprised to learn that your paycheck while you're married is considered marital money. It's considered marital property. And anything that you use that money for can also become marital property, including a 401k that you've been contributing to for years prior to the marriage. It could end up getting split. And the same thing goes for a house that you may own coming into a marriage, or a bank account that you may have coming into a marriage. If you're not kind of clear about, writing your own rules about, is this going to be mine? Is this, a joint asset, or is this just a solo asset? The default is most things end up getting lumped together in the joint asset column. And so that's why I like to say that if you think you don't have a prenup just by not signing one, you do have a prenup. It's just a different set of rules that you didn't choose that apply to your marriage.
Yeah. So that logic of like, wouldn't you prefer to have a say in what those rules are versus just letting the state kind of have their way? It definitely carries some weight, and I can definitely see the purpose behind it. Okay. So what can we put into a prenup? Like what are we allowed to govern with these, and what is not included in a prenup?
Yeah. So in terms of what would happen if the marriage comes to an end, you can decide division of assets and debts. So who would get what of your bank accounts, of your credit cards, who would be responsible for them. And then you can also address alimony. Alimony goes by a few different names. Some places it's called alimony. Some places it's called spousal support. Some places it's called spousal maintenance. What that basically means is it's money paid from one spouse to the other spouse if the marriage comes to an end. Often, if one spouse puts their career on hold, or they're taking care of children, or there's a big difference in each spouse's income, then the higher earning spouse will pay some money to help support the lower earning spouse if the marriage comes to an end. You can put all of those things in an agreement, as well as many other things like how you'll manage your money during the marriage itself. Are you going to put all of your income into a joint bank account? Or are your incomes going to go into separate bank accounts, and you'll each contribute part of your paycheck to a joint bank account to pay for the joint bills? So you can do a lot of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot put into a prenup anything having to do with child custody or child support. And the reason for that is who ends up with custody of children in a divorce case depends on what's in the best interest of the children at that point in time. And so when you get married, both people may be perfectly fine parents. And over the course of the relationship, one person could become ill or develop some type of addiction, or maybe they just move to different locations, and a 50-50 custody situation won't work. And so those decisions can only be made at the time of a divorce and can't be included in a prenup.
Okay, great to know. What about a business? So like many of my students have started their own businesses. They're feeling very entrepreneurial. They want to do side hustles as they move forward. How does that get treated?
Yeah. Business owners are one of the biggest categories of people who are typically interested in getting prenups. And a big reason is because it's very difficult to divide a business if you split up. If you get married and you're running a business, that business, even if your spouse doesn't work in the business, that business can be considered a marital asset that is up for division if you split up. And they're very difficult to value. How do you know how much a business is worth? It's not the same thing as a house where you can go get an appraiser, or a car where you can kind of look up online and see what your car is worth. There can be a big disagreement in how much a business is worth. And so a lot of people will put in the agreement that any business that I own coming into the marriage, as well as any business I may start in the future, will belong to the spouse that started it. So you can even protect assets or businesses that you don't have yet just by saying, if it's in my name, then I will retain it if the relationship comes to an end.
Okay. Because yeah, I remember hearing the story about when Jeff Bezos split with his wife, and there was a big divide of Amazon assets. I was like, wow, that was huge. I don't even know what her involvement in the business was, but you can see it like that. This happens a lot with celebrities. It happens with the average people too, right? This is not just something for wealthy people or big business owners. Like anybody can benefit or be hurt by having or not having a prenup. So speaking of, how do we do this? So like, let's start with I want to approach the conversation with my spouse or my partner before getting married. Like, how would you approach it in a way that is not going to create that feeling of, well, you're planning for us to fail?
Yeah, that's a great question because that is the $1,000,000 question. It can be
Yes.
very sticky, a taboo topic to bring up with the person that you're saying that you want to spend the rest of your life with. And my advice is to not go in saying the word prenup. Don't start off with just I want a prenup, because we can all admit that word is a little loaded, it's heavy, and sometimes it brings to mind, oh, you think the relationship is going to come to an end. You don't think we're going to make it. Instead, what I tell people to do is talk about the individual things that you want to get on the same page about with your spouse. So, it can, if you start off saying, hey, I just want to be clear about how we're going to pay the bills. Are we going to deposit our money into a joint bank account? Or are we going to keep, some separate bank accounts? Are we going to mix everything together? Or are there things that you're bringing into the marriage that you would like to keep separate? Maybe, can we just get on the same page? I don't want you to be responsible for my credit card bills that I'm bringing in, and I don't want to be responsible for your credit card bills or student loans, cars, those types of things. And really what you're doing is by deciding and getting clear with your spouse or your partner about who's going to pay which bills, how you're going to set up your bank accounts, whether the things that you're bringing into the marriage, you're going to mix them together or you're going to keep them separate. You're really having the conversation about what we would put in the prenup. And so I find that it is a lot easier once you start having these financial conversations with your partner, that it's a lot easier than down the line to say, okay, we've decided that, your inheritance that you get from your family is going to belong to you. I'm going to keep my 401k. You're going to keep your business. To make this all legal, we've got to put it in a document. That document is called a prenup. And I think it's a lot easier to have the conversation once you've established that you're not doing this to split up. You're doing this to get on the same page and make sure that you don't have any misunderstandings during the marriage itself.
So how come we can't just like draft a letter and write down all these things and both sign it, stamp our name in blood at the end or something and be like, this is it. This is our agreement. Why does that not work?
Well, each state has their own laws about what is required for a prenuptial agreement. Those laws can vary from state to state, but typically judges are going to be looking to see some very specific language in these agreements. In a lot of states, almost every state requires that the agreement be notarized. So a notary public comes in and checks to make sure you are who you say you are and signs off that signature belongs to you. A lot of states also require witnesses, meaning somebody else besides the notary public and besides you and your spouse signs the document to say, I witnessed you signing your name on this document. All things just to make sure that there's no misunderstandings, that this was an official document and the people whose signatures are on the agreement are the people who got married and said that they signed the document. So there's a lot of specific things that you need to put in the agreement. And that's why it's important to work with a lawyer who is going to be required to know these rules and know what kinds of things to put into the agreement so that it is enforceable, meaning a judge is going to recognize it and uphold it later on down the line.
Okay, so got to find a lawyer. Can any lawyer do this, or are we looking for a very specific lawyer?
You're going to want to work with a specific type of lawyer, someone who does family law, who, typically if you go to their website, they're going to say whether or not they do prenups or not, prenuptial agreements, postnuptial agreements. There are so many different types of law that even lawyers that are amazing at one type of thing may not know the rules for prenuptial agreements. So you're really going to want to go with a specialist.
Okay, so call them up, send them an email, do whatever it is, set up your appointment. You and your partner go in, talk through all these things. The lawyer is going to kind of guide you through the stuff that should be included. This is where the value comes in making sure that you're putting all the things in that you're supposed to. I found the same process with making a will, that it was important to have that guidance for like, these are the things you should include. This is the language that needs to be written in, having that witness, that signature, that sort of thing. So the same idea that when a contest happens about whether it's valid or not, or who gets what, that it's very clear what the intentions were.
That's exactly right. And it may have been the same situation when you got your will. Is the same situation for a lot of people when they get a prenup. They come in and they have a general idea of, all right, we decided that we're going to keep our own retirement accounts. But then as you have the conversation with the lawyer, you realize there's a few other things that you can do in the agreement that may not have come to mind that the lawyer can help walk you through. And that happens all the time with us. A lot of people want to talk about things like counseling. We want to write into our agreement that we're going to go to 2 or 3 counseling sessions per year during the marriage. And if we really were on the rocks and somebody was talking about the D word, that was talking about divorce, then we're going to go to 6 counseling sessions before we file with the court. Or maybe we want to have rules about social media. What can we post about each other on social media while we're getting along, or even in the event of a divorce? Those are common things that people will put in a prenuptial agreement. So it's not always just about splitting up the money. And a skilled lawyer, an experienced lawyer, can help you think about what types of rules you want to put in your agreement that may be helpful for your particular relationship.
Okay, so you got some really great advice here, everyone. Now, I know prenups and even marriage hopefully is not on the table right at this moment, considering all of you are in high school, but it may be coming soon. Like it might be straight after high school for some of you. It may be much later for most of you. And it's one of those agreements that we want to be very, very mindful and careful when we go into them, and doing these things that can help safeguard us into the future. Not a bad idea. What about if budgets are tight? Like, I'm 19, 20 years old. I'm thinking of marrying my high school sweetheart. Like, I don't got the money to hire a lawyer. Any budget friendly options that we can think about that would at least get us something to get started?
Yeah, there are some online services that can give you an example of prenups. I think that even if you use an online kind of like a downloadable guide that may cost hundreds of dollars rather than thousands of dollars, it is usually still worth at least taking whatever agreement you have and going and paying a lawyer for maybe 1 hour of their time. It could be as little as a couple $100 to have a lawyer look at the agreement and sign off on it and say, yes, this is good. You can sign this. It's going to be enforceable. And that'll also give you an opportunity to make sure that you're following your state's laws. So some jurisdictions, some states like California, for example, requires that each spouse have their own attorney when signing an agreement. That's not the rule in most states, but some states do have that. And so you want to make sure, obviously, there can be very high cost options for people who have a lot of wealth that may be more appropriate, where they're going to go into more detail in looking at what kind of assets they have. But if you are on more of the tighter budget end, you can find some agreements to give you a start. But I would still at least take it to an attorney to look over before you put your signature on it and expect that it's going to be enforced.
Okay. So guys, we're going to take a short break here. We're going to do our trivia for today. So if you haven't done this before, this is a very short trivia question where I'm going to pop up a scenario. It's going to ask you what you think is the most appropriate answer. And no one's going to know the exact answer. You're going to try and get as close as you can to the number without going over it. Let's take a look. All right. So it is National Caregivers Day when we are recording this. And the question is about how much does an assisted living facility cost on average? So median cost. So remember, median is you take the lowest, you take the highest, and you find the one that's right in the middle. And how much is that on average per year in the US? So if you need help when you get older, so you want to live in a facility that provides additional care to you, how much do you think that costs per year? It's an important one because that's something you might have to plan for in the future, depending on what your long-term goals are, or maybe you have to think a little bit more soon about it when it comes to caring for parents or grandparents. So it's another part of our finances that we should just be considering. So write down on the back of your student reflection sheet what you think the answer is, or if you don't have it, just jot it down somewhere, and we'll come back to the answer at the very end and see how you did. You got an idea, Aaron?
Oh, you put me on the spot here.
Well, you got to think about it. You can tell us at the end, but think about your number. Annual cost for assisted living facility, median across the US. All right. So the next part of our segment today about prenups, when should we do this? So like, are we talking early stages of a relationship? Is it just like the moments before you get married? Is it when you're considering proposing to someone? Like, what would you say is the ideal time to do this?
I would say right around the time of proposal. You're probably not going to bring it up on the first date or even the second date, but you don't want to wait until the day or the week prior to the wedding, because each spouse needs to have enough time to review the agreement, decide what kind of changes they might want to see in it, as well as take it to an attorney of their choice. Typically, we tell people that you want to start the process 3 to 6 months prior to your wedding date.
Okay. Because the wedding date is the legal moment where you are now tied and bound by your state's prenups agreement if you don't have your own one. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay. Now, what about if you've gotten married? So say my wife and I, like we don't have a prenup agreement, at least not one that we made. But we're like, oh, you know what? In seeing this, like this is actually a really good idea. Like maybe we should do that. How does that work once you've already you've already commingled your finances and you've already built some things together, but there was stuff that was separate beforehand? Is it a different process? Is it harder? Is it easier? Or is it the exact same?
It can be the same. You would sign what is called a postnuptial agreement, which typically there are some minor distinctions in different jurisdictions in different states, but for the most part, you can cover the same types of things in a postnuptial agreement or a postnup that you can in a prenup. You would have the same kind of determination as to what's mine, what's yours, what's ours. If you've already commingled your assets together, then it may be mostly that everything is ours. But even in those cases, I find that couples still have some things. Typically, this is going to be my car. That's your car. If I get inheritance in the future, that will belong to me. You will get inheritance from your parents. That will belong to you. And it's helpful for couples, even who are been married for 20 years, to kind of make sure that they're on the same page about which things they both consider to be ours and which things are mine and yours.
Okay. So yeah, it's never too late and something you can always consider. Is there anything else you think that's really important to talk about prenuptials before I go into the Q&A section? And for those of you guys watching, if you have questions, you're more than welcome to drop them in the chat feature. If you are watching the replay, please still drop your questions in the comment section, and Aaron and I will try and get in there to answer those for you. But anything else you think that we should talk about before we move into the Q&A?
Yeah, I would just say, that, even before I got into this type of work, I thought the same thing that maybe a lot of you are thinking, which is that, prenuptial agreements are only for the super wealthy, or for, the celebrities that you see on TV that are getting married. And the truth is that, the people who are super wealthy, they can afford to pay lawyers tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars if they go through a divorce case. And it's really people who are more middle class that I find can benefit the most from avoiding the costs that go into paying lawyers for a divorce case when you don't have an agreement as to how things would play out if your relationship comes to an end. How would the assets be divided? Who would be responsible for the debts? And so they're certainly not just for the rich and famous.
That's it, guys. It's for everyone now. It is one of those things that has a cost to it, and you want to try and balance out like, okay, how much am I paying for this? But the cost upfront. So, I mean, Aaron, can you give us a ballpark? Like if you're going to hire a lawyer to help you create a prenup agreement, and maybe like not one that you've started online, but like you're starting the process with them, they're going to walk you through the whole thing. Like how much could we expect? And I know that's a hard one to do because like every state's different and all that, but can you give me like a ballpark idea of what we might expect to see?
Yeah, usually you're talking about maybe $3,000, give or take, $1,000 again, depending. There are some places where you might be able to get a lawyer, a good lawyer to draft it for as low as $1,500, $2,000. It may be closer to $4,000 to $5,000 in some jurisdictions. Some people think that is. That's higher than they expected. Some people may think that that's lower than they expected. But when you think about the average cost of a wedding in the United States today is around $25,000 to $30,000, we're really talking about a tiny fraction of what already goes into the cost of most couples getting married today.
Yeah, no, it is one of those ones that it's a big number when you think about it for what you're getting, and then you have to really think about like, well, no, what's the cost on the other side if divorce does happen, and can we save ourselves a lot of time, stress, money, all those things with being a little proactive right now. So if it's something you can afford to do, definitely do it. But I find lawyers in general, command very solid fees, like regardless of what type of law you're talking about. Like it's not a cheap service to hire, but I'm sure there's a ton of training in becoming a lawyer. Like, actually give us the 30-second overview. How do you become what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got to go through 4 years of college and 3 years of law school, and then what you're really paying for is a lot of the experience that the lawyers gather over the years. In my career, I have participated in over 1,000 divorce cases, and so I've seen every type of scenario that there possibly could be out there, and I believe I can be really helpful to a couple who's getting married to help them plan around some of the pitfalls that we see couples run into, and avoid a lot of what I think are the predictable arguments that harm relationships, that break up marriages. And if we can't address those on the front end, I definitely think it's a small price to pay, certainly to avoid the expense of a divorce, but maybe we can avoid the divorce altogether by getting on the same page about money issues, which we know are arguments that are easy for couples to have.
And actually, this ties really well with this first question that came in from Elijah. It was, how often do prenuptial agreements ruin relationships? And it not even just ruin, but like in your experience, how often do two people realize, you know what, actually, we're not meant for each other, or we're not compatible because they start doing the homework before they get married like this?
Yeah, it is a very small percentage. I have seen a couple of people who have started the process of a prenuptial agreement, and it has ended up in them not going forward with getting married. And some people may think that is unfortunate, but really what it's done is it's shown the couple that they weren't compatible when it came to their finances. I mean, typically, if talking about the prenup is going to hurt the relationship, that usually means that they weren't on the same page about their expectations financially for the relationship. Maybe one spouse thought that they were going to keep all of their assets, and the other spouse thought that they're going to go in and join all of their assets together. And it is better, in my view, to find that out at the beginning of the relationship than to discover that you're incompatible financially 5 or 10 years down the line.
And I think that is solid relationship advice, guys, as well. Like, as Aaron said, like maybe not first or second date, like you're not talking about your wealth or your finances or debt, but before any sort of marriage conversation or legally binding yourselves or commingling finances comes around, you should be at least aware of like, what does the other person have in terms of assets? Do they have a lot of debt? Are they a spender kind of person? Are they a saver kind of person? And am I okay with that? Is that going to be compatible with what I want? And what do they want? What are their life goals? Those are questions that you should be talking about before you approach something like marriage. And I do find like some couples avoid those conversations altogether until marriage has already happened. And then it's a little late for that, because now you're realizing, oh, actually, we want different things, or we want to manage things in different ways. So if it sounds uncomfortable, it might be, but you might also learn some really important stuff before you take a bigger leap in the future. It could save you a lot of time, stress, money, all the stuff. Okay, so we answer a lot of these questions already. Like, so Jay wants to know like how much a prenup costs. We got a ballpark for that. The big one, of course, like how do you ask for that prenup without sounding like you want to leave them? I thought Aaron had some wonderful advice about just kind of talking about like, well, how do we want to manage our money moving forward? So being very proactive about like, how are we going to do things versus like, this is what's going to happen at the end. And I think that was really great advice. I love that advice. And we think about that with any group project or business agreement that we do. Like, it's about us moving forward and how we're going to act. Okay, so the debt one, what is the default if two people come into a marriage with debt? Like, so say we got student loans, car loans, mortgage. So like if people don't have a prenup in general, what happens to debt that they bring into a marriage?
Well, it's going to depend a lot on the type of debt that it is. If you have if you have credit card debt, typically that is going to stay with you. If you have student loan debt, that may stay with you. Whereas if you have tax debt, it's common for married couples to start filing their taxes jointly. And once you're joined in that way, the IRS or the state tax division can come after your joint tax return and your joint tax refund and garnish your joint bank accounts. And other lenders may come after if you have money in a joint bank account, you may have debt before marriage and you say, okay, that credit card is your debt or that car loan is just your debt. But if the debt collectors come knocking, they're not going to stay away from a joint bank account just because the other spouse's name is on it. So, even if you have an agreement, and typically if you were to go through a divorce, you may keep that credit card debt. But, again, like you were saying, Rob, it's one of the reasons why it's so important to disclose what assets and debts you have coming into a relationship so that you're not surprised that your spouse has 50,000 of credit card debt or 100,000 of student loan debt years into the relationship after, debt collectors start calling the house or a tax refund gets taken back by the government, or you're applying for a mortgage and you can't qualify because your credit isn't good enough or your debt is too high. So, we will address debt in prenuptial agreements very often.
Very cool. Good question from Hunter. Lily had a great one as well. So once we make it, is this set in stone, never to be touched again, or can we go back and adjust this? Do people regularly go back and maintain their prenup and like revisit it and be like, okay, we're still good with this, or do most people just kind of set it and forget it?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say that most people, the majority, probably set it and forget it, but it is not unusual at all for people to come back and make changes to their agreement, either because something changed in their relationship that they didn't anticipate. Maybe they weren't planning on having kids and they had kids, and one person is leaving their job and they want to, build in some additional protection for themselves, maybe some alimony, maybe they want to guarantee a certain split of assets. Or maybe they started off thinking that they would keep their assets mostly separate, and as the years have gone on, find that it makes more sense to join more of their finances. So, yes, you can make changes to your agreement. Typically, you're basically going to turn your prenup into a postnup by making some changes, but you go through the very similar process as you would in signing a prenup.
Okay. And kind of similar question, like, can you just cancel it? Can you take it back? Gabby wants to know.
Yeah, you can. You can basically revoke the prenuptial agreement, but you've got to sign a separate agreement that says we are revoking this, prenup. We no longer want it. We no longer need it in place. You cannot just rip up a contract. I know that sometimes you see that on TV where people say, oh, I'm done, and you rip the contract in half. That does not take away the enforceability of the agreement. You got to sign a separate one.
Okay. And then another great question here. So what happens if one person wants it and the other does not? Is it possible to create some sort of protection for yourself if you're the one who wants it? Or is this something that like you literally have to agree to it before anything can be enforceable?
Yeah, both parties have to agree to it the same way that for any contract that you sign. Both parties to the agreement, both sides that sign the document have to agree to it, or there is no agreement. There's no prenup. There, may be other things that you can do to protect some of your assets or debts from going into the marriage, but none are going to be as effective as coming up with an agreement that you and your spouse can both live with. What I usually say is, this is a chance for negotiation. If you are getting married and planning on spending the rest of your lives together, you're going to do a whole lot of negotiating with your spouse and learning how to compromise. And this might be your first test to try to meet in the middle and find something that you and your spouse can both live with.
Okay. And then the last one, which we kind of already addressed, but let's go revisit that one more time. So like, how necessary for the average person? Like, do you think that everybody should have one?
I do think that every married couple should at least go through the process of learning what their state's laws say, having the same conversations that you would have in getting a prenup in terms of disclosing all of your assets and debts to your partner, talking about whether you want to join your finances into one bank account, whether you want to keep separate bank accounts, and getting clear about who's going to be responsible for what debts, what bills, and make sure you're on the same page about our retirement accounts. Are we considering these joint assets? Maybe you had the house before the other one moved in. Are we just going to call that 100% joint assets? And so even if you don't go through with actually getting the legal document signed, it is definitely a smart idea to go through the same kind of process of disclosing assets and debts and having the important financial conversations with your partner at the beginning of your relationship.
And I think you are giving us some sort of resource, right, to help us with this, the 7 steps to a marriage saving prenup.
That is right. It's a free download that's available for everyone here, and it will take you through a lot of what we're talking about here, the steps that you would go through. And spoiler alert, step 7 is to put it down in writing into a formal agreement. But the first 6 steps can be used by anybody in terms of having the right conversations and getting on the same page about the financial questions that you and your partner should be asking each other.
And if you guys are wondering where that is on the student activity document that came with this presentation at the very bottom on the second page. It's a hyperlink that you can click. And I will also put it in the description of this YouTube video once it is fully published. So you can find it there as well. All right, Aaron, I ask one question of every guest who comes on, and that is, what is your number one tip for teens to build wealth in the future? And I'd love to know what yours would be.
My number one, and I'm biased because this is my area. My number one, I am a firm believer that getting married, the decision to get married and the person that you married is the biggest financial decision that you can make in your life. And so, my advice would be to make sure that you are on the same page, that you're not avoiding the conversations that may be a little tricky or difficult. And I think that is really an investment in your financial future, to get on the same page with your partner when it comes to your finances.
Oh, for sure, guys. Like it is a huge power move when you join 2 income earning people together, or 2 finance together, or 2 heads better than one. It can increase your income. It can decrease your expenses. It can change your tactics on how you build wealth. And then it also has the potential to break those things down as well. So both sides of the coin, it's a powerful move, and you want to treat it with as much respect as you can, and be very mindful when you move forward with who that person is going to be that you want to join yourself to for the rest of your life, or however long it ends up being. So wonderful advice from Aaron on that one. Okay, let's find out the answer to our trivia question. Did you think of something yet, Aaron?
I may be off. I'm gonna throw out a guess there. I'm gonna say 35,000.
Okay, let's find out. Okay, so yeah, you guys saw it there. 68,000 is the median cost for an assisted living facility. That's not the highest. That's not the lowest. That is the one in the middle. So it is often one of those expenses that people are very caught out about. Like, oh my gosh, that is a lot of money. That is $5,700 or $5,676 per month to afford an assisted living facility. So that is one of those big reasons for getting those retirement accounts started, having long-term care insurance, all these things that would help you cover those expenses in the future. And then also, if you are worried about being responsible for a parent or a grandparent and their care in the future, either you setting up those accounts to help pay for it, or checking to see like, hey, do you guys have anything set up for this sort of thing? Or what's your plan here when care is needed? And it's one of those other awkward conversations that we can have, but certainly saying like, hey, we talked about this in class today. Would love to know what you think or what you do. Those are great ways to enter into these conversations in a safe and respectful way. All right. Aaron, thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us a little bit more about where we can find you or learn more from you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's been a blast. You can obviously go to the website, prenups.com, or you can find me on social media, Prenup Guy.
Yeah. Prenup guy, great stuff on Instagram. That's where I follow you and where I learned so much from you. Particularly today, I learned about commingling finances, and I was like, oh, that is something that I did not know about. And I love learning these new things. And that's the purpose behind these conversations, everyone, is when you see these guest speakers, if you see someone or you hear someone that I want to learn more from that person, add them to your social media feed, make it part of your routine of when you're looking through what's going on social media, or what you're seeing, or what news is popping up, that you're also getting some positive learning information as well, and not just the other stuff that pops up on social media. So we want to try and surround you with great messages and information about money, so when your class is over, you continue to learn. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Watch out for more of these coming up in the near future. We have some really cool ones, particularly around sustainable investing, which I'm very excited about, and looking for college grants and scholarships. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye, Aaron.